Welcome back to the Locked On Hornets podcast. Today, we welcome a familiar guest. Katie Heindl joins us. She writes for a ton of outlets. You can follow her on Twitter at WTEVS. She also writes for Basketball Feelings on Substack.com. If you want to go check her work out there, it's phenomenal. We're going to be talking about a couple of pieces that she's written really within the last 6 months or so. And Katie, I want to start with your feelings regarding Miles Bridges, the physical altercation that took place with Michelle Johnson that we still have zero details on how the NBA or how the Charlotte Hornets are going to deal with this, but we did get Michelle Johnson post that was really disturbing. We got the initial TMZ report that broke the news that even with the lack of details were disturbing, just basically with the "she required medical attention" line in there. I want to get your reaction to how the public talked about this following the initial TMZ report, and as well as the following reaction to Michelle Johnson's post, because you put that thread on Twitter discussing the problems with quote unquote evidence coming in the way of photos and videos that I thought was really important.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of twofold. I think at first, hearing the allegations against Miles Bridges was very upsetting. It was pretty awful. The reaction to it was probably was just as upsetting, which was a lot of people framing it as him fumbling the bag, or like blowing this big perceived contract that he was up for in free agency. And that was what really, I think that's what really got under my skin in terms of wanting to write what I wrote about it on Basketball Feelings, is just this way that we center athletes, and typically male athletes, in situations like this in these discussions versus centering in this case, his wife, or like the person who's at the hands of the abuser. So usually also women in this case, and framing it around the fallout on men, and framing it around like what's going to happen to them and how this is like such a negative thing, in this case for Bridges. I think that was probably the most problematic thing for me. And that's something that we see over and over again, especially in basketball media and sports media at large. And I think just like in the wider way that we have these conversations, or perhaps don't necessarily have these conversations.
Well, and in that too, you talked about, right, photos and videos serving as that evidence to where then women are afforded the benefit of the doubt, and even not in some cases that, to be honest with you, in a lot of cases, but they're not given the benefit of the doubt before then. There are so many questions surrounding that accusation and what we call it. And then you get these horrible photos. And then by that time, it's awful. It's disturbing to look at. But it's unfortunate that it takes that for men, for a lot of people, to try to believe what's taking place. And I think you did a really good job in discussing some of those problems. Why do you think that people need that to believe it? And how problematic is that?
Because people don't believe women, because women are usually secondary, they're secondary sources of information, even when they are the source of information. Their accounts aren't seen as as prominent or as important. I think in the case of athletes and famous athletes, and then athletes, I think, that are always at the crux of something. If we want to go back and think about this, the same thing happened with Derrick Rose. The same thing happened with Kristaps Porzingis. Those were athletes that were either up for trades or, kind of at this hanging at what could have been the precipice of their career, right? And are afforded the benefit of the doubt because it is seen as more impactful what's happening to them, their actions, that, the harm that they've inflicted on someone else is going to be more impactful to them. So the fact that we need proof of harm, I understand needing proof of harm as a body of evidence if there's going to be criminal charges pressed, which is a whole other conversation. But in terms of public proof of harm, and that we require that from women to show these pictures, or in Michelle Johnson's case, pictures, there was a video of one of their children talking about Miles Bridges choking Michelle Johnson, and that he'd witnessed that. She had the very long post that she accompanied those photos with. This is very gutting, graphic stuff that is completely private and should, not be beholden to the public, or certainly the audience of NBA fans. But that it took that much for, I'm sure, a lot of people to say, oh, wait, maybe there's something here. That's a larger problem in itself. And again, that's the problem, I think, of this kind of knee-jerk response to women coming forward with allegations of abuse and assaults, that there's still doubt. Like doubt is still the response for quite a lot of people. And then with athletes, I think it gets even more convoluted because there's this sense that women are after something, or like women are just trying to defame someone. They want money. Like there's a lot of really grosser things that get tied up into it. And it doesn't make it any less complicated. And it's already a complicated thing that I think a lot of people are uncomfortable discussing. I think a lot of people get worried about saying the wrong thing. So maybe say nothing or like decide not to discuss it when, that's a problem too, because I think the more we normalize talking about this kind of stuff, the better it will be ultimately.
And it seemed like the photos and the video and the descriptions in her post broke down or made ridiculous a lot of the framing that people were starting to build around the situation. And going to sort of sports media or sports reporting, you've written about this and on your Substack Basketball Feelings in an article called "Abolish the Stat Line," and you talk about that a lot of write-ups in these situations, reporters never forget to drop the sort of box score stat line at the end of these articles when discussing these situations. Why do you think they do that, and what troubles you about that particular culture or repetition that you constantly see in these situations?
I think it's kind of a holdover in sports reporting, to be honest. I think it's one of those things that hasn't necessarily been closely examined as to why we still need it or why it's even relevant. Because I think for some people, the thought is, well, that will clarify who this person is that the story is about. Perhaps it clarifies like their role on the team. But now, like, we just have Google for that. And if you're a fan, like if you're an NBA fan, it's likely that you already know who that person is. Or in the article, if there's something that specifies like who this person is and what team they play for, to me, that's enough, because all the stat line really does is attach a perceived value to that person, right? Their valuation as a player and their perceived worth to the franchise, right? Or their worth to the franchise if they're ostensibly suspended or, taken off that team or something like that. So again, I think it's like it's a forgiving way, I think, of framing a lot of allegations. Whereas you don't really see that, like, if a pilot was accused of something similar, it wouldn't be like, oh, they've been flying for this many years and they like landed this many planes successfully. Or like you even think of it in terms of like CEOs, like you don't put their like latest achievements in terms of maybe the revenue that they got their company in the last year, because it's not relevant.
Right.
So in that way, I don't think the stat line, like including stats, is relevant anymore in terms of just straight up reporting, because it's not useful. It doesn't lend to the story. And then in the abolish the stat line, the suggestion I had, if we're going to do that, is to then, in cases of where we're going to continue talking about athletes, because, Miles Bridges is a good example. This is probably going to be really drawn out. These things are never cut and dry. Like they're certainly. And that's because of the CBA and also the way that the NBA tends to handle these allegations. Is if we're going to continue reporting on it, why not have an asterisk or something like that that also outlines the allegations that this person is still dealing with, or in some cases like where the court case, if it gets that far, is at, because that's more relevant to the story to me than like in Miles Bridges' case. How many rebounds he was able to get this season, right? Or like what is his shooting percentages?
Right. You won't see that in a write up about a game. You won't see those. It's the reverse doesn't really. And in this particular situation, it seemed like not the stat line, although that was there in some of the just sort of basic reporting of this situation, but also it seemed like there was a lot of discussion around the timing of this and that giving it some importance. Do you feel like both in the sports reporting world, but also in our world, sports commentary, that it's almost, the framing of it is almost like an excuse or like a signal to listeners or viewers or readers to say, hey, this is why I can talk about it. This is why I have to talk about this situation, because this is why it's important to the sports world. Did you see some of that idea in there?
Yeah. And like, that's a great point, because I think what you're saying, and this is true, is that it gives leeway to discuss Miles Bridges almost like and take the allegations and kind of set the allegations aside, because it's more of like, well, how is this impactful to the Hornets? How is this impactful to Miles Bridges' career? I was like, to prepare for this, I was looking back to see if there was any news that's come out like over the weekend, and had seen a couple stories of just like, cap. Where does it put the Hornets in terms of like cap considerations? If they trade Bridges, or if they rescind the basically
right.
any qualifying offer to him. And like, that's very interesting, because those stories were quite detailed, but none of them mention the allegations themselves. So I think it gives a certain allowance into discussing Miles Bridges, as you say, in terms of like, well, this is relevant to sports, and this is relevant to sports commentary, and like the human side of it is not relevant. Where in this case, they're so intertwined that it just seems completely ignorant to me, to like try and step outside of it, because you can't, it shouldn't be safe, and it shouldn't feel uncomfortable to discuss these things. I think when it does feel uncomfortable, that's when you're getting at something.
Yeah. Katie, especially when you have people having this type of commentary on the outside, whether it be Twitter, whether it be somebody commenting on a piece that you wrote for Substack, when people comment, we have to let the legal process play out. What is your reaction to that, and and your thoughts on when people put that thing out there instead of trying to focus on the issue at hand?
Can I add something to that, because I think that speaks to the previous question, because I think there's a level of discomfort, because this is so intimate and so personal and so messy, and so when we discuss these things, I think people lean on that immediately, the legal process, this mystical, magical legal process that will figure everything out, and it will make it way less uncomfortable for me to talk about, because we'll have this court case that plays out, because all of this is so messy.
Yeah, I mean, I try and not engage in those conversations anymore, though I do find myself sometimes like going down the rabbit hole, just because I feel like the people that lean on those the most tend to think of this as a very tidy space, or like exist in a world where they believe that to be true. But like, I'm in Canada, you guys are in the States, the worlds that we live in, that kind of like guilty, not guilty framework, it doesn't exist, especially in cases of domestic assault and domestic violence. And like, you can just look back in instances like this in the NBA and see where like, what would you qualify to those people? I would ask, like, what would you qualify guilty or not guilty? Like, would Miles Bridges be not guilty if Michelle Johnson decided to drop the charges? Mm-hmm. But then you look at that, like, that's not an admission of her saying this didn't happen. It's not a erasure of, the harm that was caused to her. It maybe has something to do with like custody concerns. Does she want Miles Bridges to be able to see their children? Like, there's larger implications and ramifications, I think, of that. This isn't a black and white issue, like there's a lot of gray area. And to your point, I think that's why people do get uncomfortable, because it's like, let's wait for the facts is also another thing. Like, let's wait for both sides. I think like a lot of what it's kind of ironic, because the NBA otherwise is pure speculation. Like to be like, that's what you guys and I do a lot of the time, especially in free agency, right? Like if you want to frame it that way. So with this, we actually have a lot more information than we would in like the world of pure speculation of like the typical NBA and the way that it works. So it's like, we know we know that he was arrested, right? Like we know that that police report that came out, I think was pretty damning before the pictures. Right. The medical report. Then she decided to go ahead and show like public proof of harm into what had happened to her. To me, that's quite a lot of information. And like, yes, my side is to always believe women, because, when the statistics are 24 women per minute being basically being the victims of assault, domestic abuse in the United States, and like 1 in 3 women being the victims of violent domestic abuse by their partners, the stats hold up in that case to me. So
Right. It's not baseless by any means
No.
to believe a
Yeah.
woman. And that's what,
So,
right.
yeah.
You see that all
And
the
I
time.
just to finish, I just think that like we've never seen these things play out cleanly
Right.
or in court that is like even like satisfactory to either. I think of like the Derrick Rose case where like, yeah, in the end, I suppose it was a civil court. And I think people also don't understand the differences between that to say like he was not guilty. This is not true, you know? And like in that case, even Derrick Rose admitting he didn't know what consent was. So like there's things where it just kind of depends where your head's at and who you're already assigning credibility to, which to me, when people want to go down that road and think of like the guilty, not guilty dichotomy, you are already assigning, those people are usually already assigning more credibility to the men in this case or to the pro athletes in this case than to the women.
You know, we've talked so much about discomfort surrounding, you know, domestic violence and how we talk about it, whether it's our job, whether you're a fan. I think some of that discomfort comes specifically on the fans' part because they love Miles Bridges as a Charlotte Hornets fan, and they grew up with him because he was drafted here, because he's the longest tenured player and all of that, which they think matters. And then maybe just subconsciously having developed some feelings in a different way for that athlete than others. And so they don't want this to be true. And then they respond with, let's let the legal process play out. Katie, you are in what I would argue a unique position to talk about Miles even specifically because you did do a profile on him that we talked to you about. I think it was in February. And does that recontextualize some things as far as when you go back and look at your profile at all? Like your experience creating it, does it get contextualized because of this?
It's a really good question. And I think it's something that fans and like ourselves in media should grapple with a lot more. It doesn't recontextualize the story because the story to me was like told at a period in time, you know, through a longer conversation that I was able to have with Miles Bridges. As a person, I can admit, who was a fan of Miles Bridges, when you get this kind of news, it sucks.
Yeah.
But I mean, it sucks on a lot of other facets. It sucks because this is like, you can imagine the harm that he put someone through, right? And like the ramifications of that on Michelle Johnson and his children. And it sucks because it's human nature to root for people, right? And like, even if we're unbiased reporters, like we still have people that we talk to in this job that we come to root for and want the best for. So I think to reconcile some of that surprise, you know, and in this case, like a really visceral response and feeling pretty upset is totally natural. And I think honestly, it's something we should do more of. Like it doesn't make you, I think it like makes a stronger case if you can go back and say like, yeah, man, like I really was rooting for this person. I saw like the value, like in that story, you know, for example, the value of like this career on an upward trajectory. It doesn't cancel that out, but I think like we have to get better at being very quick to separate the real world, right? And instances where that's where this happened from the basketball world and like a career that we were hoping the best for, because now it's just like, you have to be able to let go. I've written about that before. I think you have to be very good at just kind of like severing your tie as like a fan or someone who had a good experience with someone and holding that to be truth, because that's just like a tiny facet of somebody's life, my life and his life, in terms of writing that story. And this has much wider ramifications and real world and serious ramifications for their lives. So I think it's good to sit with those kind of discomfort, like uncomfortable feelings, and maybe feeling hurt and upset and thinking like, well, why do I feel inclined to like root for this person still and for them to like beat the allegations? That's not my words. Right. I do not feel that way. But I think as fans, that can be something that people get caught up with. And that makes it harder for them to perhaps like see the truth in these stories. And again, I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think it's, again, something that everybody has to get better at.
And it's not something that's exclusive to sports, right? I mean, you can zoom out and understand that these situations involve our families and our friends and people we admire that don't dunk a basketball. And to pull back, I love that idea of like pulling back and thinking about, why does my idolization of this person affect my ability to understand this situation, because that can be applied to people in just normal, again, people that don't dunk a basketball that get involved in these situations. So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, you only ever see, like, even your closest friends, right? Like, you only ever see one side of them or certain sides of them, depending on the environment and the context that you know them in. Like, you have to be prepared to understand that everybody's life is a lot broader than that. You know, people as humans, like, are capable of a lot more good and bad than what you get to see in any given moment. And with NBA players specifically, like, yes, I get that the NBA can feel so public facing and it can feel really like stripped down and bare and like available. I think that's what makes it so exciting. It's definitely what makes it so exciting and fun for me to write about it and cover it, you know, is that it feels like you get to know the people playing it beyond just their games and their physical abilities on the floor. But that's not true, right? Like, that's true to a point. And like, that's part of the entertainment value of it and the product of it. But at the end of the day, like, you don't know what happens, right? When guys go home to their families. And I think it's important to recognize that.
Katie, last question for me. How do we talk about this? How do we talk about Miles Bridges a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, when we are acknowledging on-court accomplishments, on-court play, evaluation? You know, we see this oftentimes in the NFL because, one, domestic violence, you've just had a lot more cases in the National Football League, but you see it there quite a bit where we do talk about Tyreek Hill in a different light. I mean, you can name a whole bunch of different players in that situation. But how do we discuss Miles Bridges, assuming he does play in the NBA, and because evidence has shown us that? How do we talk about him?
Yeah, I think it's important not to be revisionist. You know, I can think of like I think it was this season when Kendrick Nunn was playing, and I don't know who was calling that game, but someone said like, how did this guy go undrafted? Completely disregarding the violent assault allegations that he faced in college, you know. Or I can think of like numerous times with Derrick Rose when he had like a fine game, and it was like, is this the comeback story like we've been waiting for? Like, is this kind of the redemption arc we've been waiting for? We have to be careful about like, who are these redemption arcs for, like their perceived value, and like, what are they from? Like, what are you redeeming this person from? Because one, like, it shouldn't exist, like, sports shouldn't exist as like a buffer or to cover up somebody's actions in real life that, again, inflicted harm and had a very long lasting impact on somebody else's life. So I think, you know, you've still got to hold athletes accountable. There can't just be a level of erasure because somebody has a good game, or like, I don't know, we know the NBA's track record in these cases, it's not that great. So my gut, as much as I wish that this one, being so visceral and with the timing that it's kind of come down, that we don't see Miles Bridges playing basketball anymore, but that's generally not what happens. You know, I think of what happened with the Portland Blazers hiring Chauncey Billups, and like the fake investigations, basically, that they said that they went into his background, and then it was, you know, found out that they didn't contact anybody that was involved in the rape case, you know, that he had gone through previously. So, and that went away very quickly. I know there was a lot of heat and attention on it in his initial interview with the team, but then people kind of get really comfortable, I think, with the status quo. And I get it. People want to get comfortable again. People don't want to talk about this stuff all the time. It can be very taxing. But again, I would say, like, think about how taxing it is to the people, to the women that have, you know, gone through it, and kind of have to be reminded of this every time. And, you know, that's what I wrote about, like, seeing male colleagues in the industry kind of easily be able to turn away from this stuff because they feel like they've done their due diligence or like talked about it once, you know, and then want to get back to talking about caps and like trade deadlines. Like, that's very disheartening. So I think about who is kind of seeing your actions, and beyond that, like professionally, like everybody has women in their lives. So think about like the things that you say and what that signals to them, you know, because you also don't know what they've gone through in the past. So I think it's important to just keep quite a broad approach to this kind of stuff, and to reference it again, you know, because the Bridges case, I'm sure, will be ongoing. So if we're going to talk about Bridges a year from now, I think it's important as a caveat to include like a reference to what we're talking about right now.